Thank you for joining us today for If You Must Close, Do It Right, Integrity and Student-Centeredness Until the End. At this time, I would like to start the presentation. My name is Tiffany Lee. I serve as a Vice President for Institutional Field Relations at the Commission, and I will turn it to my co-presenters, starting with Paula.
Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Paula Langto and served as the former president of Presentation College in South Dakota when it closed. Currently, I am serving as a principal consultant for academic game changers, using that information that I learned and best practices on closure to help other institutions facing this crisis. I'm really pleased to be here today.
Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Peter Zero-Llanos. I was the Associate Dean and Department Chair at the Briarcliff College during their closure. And currently, in my present role, I am the Dean of Academic Administration at LIM College in New York. And I am thrilled to be here. Look forward to the opportunity to give you some great information.
Thank you, Paula and Peter. Today, we're going to discuss the steps involved in preparing for an orderly institutional closure, as well as how to serve as an effective teach-out partner for students. Our presenters will cover the components that you see listed on this slide. So now we'll move forward and we'll start with covering advanced planning. And we'll start by covering the various items in advanced planning. So at this time, I'll call on Paula to start the conversation around internal and external timelines that your institution used when preparing for closure. And we'll start with that on the next slide.
Thank you. I appreciate that, Tiffany. It's really important to plan in advance. There are a lot of preparation steps that have to take place before the actual announcement. I suggest to my clients at least 10 to 12 months prior to closing the institution that the planning be done in earnest. Even before the board vote, there are many things that you can do knowing that your institution is looking at potential closure. But certainly between the board vote and the public announcement, which should come at least one semester prior to the closing of the institution to give the students time for all of the things that need to take place. In between, there's a lot of advanced planning as well. So we can't emphasize enough, which is why we have 4 slides on advanced planning, how much needs to be done before the institution announces or closes its doors. Peter, did you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thanks, Paula. So regarding the timeline, I just give a little bit of context, I guess, as it relates to Briarcliff College, a very specific institution with regards to this teach out. Briarcliff had made the decision to close, and this was acknowledged by Middle States in February of 2016. Briarcliff then, the next step in the process, they stopped accepting new students. From that point on, they then held town hall meetings and they held individual meetings with students. One of our campuses, our Bethpage campus, then proceeded to close approximately April of 2018. Then our online and Patchogue campus closed in December of 2018. Finally, our Middle States accreditation ceased in January 1st of 2019. So that's just a rough idea, looking at a rough outline of how things proceeded at Briarcliff. Okay, thank you.
Thank you both for covering those timelines. Transitioning to compliance processes. Institutions from according to Middle States, institutions must submit a substantive change request for institutional closure to the Commission more than 6 months prior to the date of that closure to allow sufficient time to implement an orderly closure and teach-out plan. However, there are other components that go into ensuring compliance beyond the formerly regional accrediting agency. And so Paula, starting with you, can you please share how your institution handled compliance processes while navigating closure?
I think one of the most important things I would share is that your reaccreditor, your accrediting organization, is really a fantastic source of help for you. And a lot of institutions are afraid to talk to their accreditors. They're afraid to let them in on the fact that they're considering closure. But in fact, there are so many resources and so much support that you can get from your regional accreditor. You also will have to, like in our case, we had HLC was our accreditor, and we had to submit a provisional plan. And that provisional plan had to provide a lot of the advanced preparation materials, how each student, where they were in their program, and how we were going to finish out the number of students that we were able to finish out, and then provide support for the students that would need to move on to another institution to finish. So there's a lot of apparatus, there's a lot of support, a lot of ideas that you can get from your regional accreditor. Don't be afraid to reach out, but also recognize that you're going to have to do some things with the Department of Education, with the program accreditors for your organization. The Attorney General in your state is going to be interested in what is happening to the endowment. You'll also need to be reaching out to confidentially reaching out to potential teach-out partners. I'm tripping over my tongue today. To make sure that you have planned in advance for your students. So all of these pieces, your regional accreditor will help you navigate. The Department of Education will help you navigate. So the sooner you can talk to them, the greater the support that you will get through the process.
Thank you, Paula. Another component when we're thinking about the advanced planning of navigating an institutional closure are the steps with internal preparation. So as we advance to the next slide, I'm going to ask Peter to start the conversation off and share a little bit more about how your prior institution navigated internal planning while in this advanced planning phase.
Thank you, Tiffany. So I'll look to cover academic continuity and some student support services. So in academic continuity, and we'll go into greater detail a little later on in the presentation, but just some things to consider are looking at course offerings and scheduling. Once a teach out is announced, it becomes a very cumbersome process, a very time-oriented process to look at and map out every student's schedule, what students need to complete. And it really depends on the nature of the institution and the type of teach out that you will be doing. And we'll get into a little bit more detail about that in the future. With Briarcliff, we were able to actually accommodate all of our students through Briarcliff. We did not have any teach out agreements with other institutions. Most of our students did not transfer. Most of them stayed at Briarcliff. So we really had to look at course offerings. We had to consider what the numbers were of students when they were graduating, when they were completing programs, what courses we needed to offer, what faculty we needed in order to support that. So we'll go into details about that, talk about degree completion, faculty roles, needing to be able to retain faculty, qualified faculty to teach the courses. That's extremely important. Our commitment was to provide the highest level of education and experience to our students, regardless of the fact that it was in a teach out, and that was kind of a negative. We really had to present it in a positive way and make sure that students felt like they were getting, the thing that you can do is you can up the customer service. You can make your customer service that much better, that much more focused, and you can provide almost one-on-one with your students. So you can look to find the benefits and the opportunities in a very negative situation. So we'll talk a little bit about that further on academic continuity. As it relates to student support services, advising. Students have lots of questions. They want to know whether or not their degree is still going to be good, right? Is this degree valid? And it's going to present a problem for me when I try to get a job or I want to transfer. So that's going to be important. Career counseling and job placement. Students that graduate, they're going to want to know about that. That's going to be super important, making sure that they get placed still and that they get jobs. The mental health and wellness services, we'll talk a little bit more about that, and resources and contacts. So we'll go into more depth. Let me pass that on to Paula. I think she'll pick up on the teach out partners and the other stuff. Paula?
Thanks, Peter. A lot of what we're talking about now is advanced preparation prior to the announcement. And so it is important at that time to map out the students where they are in the program and what they need to complete before announcement so that you can make the preparations for helping them complete their programs. At presentation, we were not able to teach out all of our students. We knew that. We were going to be announcing in January and closing our doors in August. And we're a four-year institution with graduate programs as well. So we knew there was no way that we would be able to teach out all of those students. But we were able to identify the students who were close enough that between the spring and summer semester would be able to finish. And we actually created a summer session to help the students that just needed a few more credits after May to be able to finish their degrees and make sure that we scheduled those courses. And in the case of presentation, we went out and fundraised to pay for those students who needed the summer classes because they wouldn't have their financial aid, which was used in spring and fall. We paid for those classes for them to finish. So if they were close enough that they would be able to finish that degree by August, we bent over backwards to make sure we provided the courses and the timeline to help every student finish. And that's part of that academic continuity. The other piece of this is preparing teach-out partners, because the students that we couldn't help finish before August, we knew we had to find another way for them to finish. So confidentially, in the advanced planning stage, when we haven't announced yet, we reached out to other institutions to begin the process of developing teach-out partners. We started, of course, with our larger programs, but the goal with teach out is for every single student to have an opportunity to go somewhere else. And so we made sure that every major had at least two institutions that would take all of their credits, and we'll talk more about teach out in another slide, but that would help them through the teach out process. That was just a little taste of what's to come. And then we continued to develop teach out partners after announcement, because that is critical. And we'll talk about the distinctive difference between teach out and transfer. Before announcement, it's also important to develop a staggered employee separation plan. And what this is to figure out which employees you need to keep all the way to through May, and others through August, and some beyond that who were working on records transfer and asset disposition. And we also looked at, as Peter mentioned, it's so important that the students have advisors. Well, we made sure that the faculty and staff who had focused before on recruitment, that those efforts could be shifted to focus on advising, and they could be trained to advise those students on teach out and transfer, so that we weren't just immediately cutting off the employment of some employees like recruiters, because we knew how much they were valued, and we wanted to make sure they had time to transition and that we could have their capacity available to help students through the transition as well. So coming up with that staggered employee separation is really important, as well as if there are any funds available for severance packages. Comprehensive communications were a huge part of this. One of the things Peter mentioned is students are going to be asking, is my degree still worth something? We wrote all of these communications in advance, and at the moment of announcement, had them prepared to be posted on the website. And that's really important, because once you announce, there are going to be so many questions. If you can anticipate those questions and get those communications prepared in advance, you'll be in a much better place. Thank you. Tiffany?
Thank you, Paula. Thank you both for those very insightful answers. So when you're thinking about those internal preparations, of course, there are things that the institution has to consider externally as well. So we'll transition to that next slide. And Paula, I'll ask you to touch base on what are those external transfer components that stakeholders should keep in mind when they're advanced planning for an institutional closure.
Thank you. So records retention and storage is critical, and it's very important to identify the institution that will serve as the place for records retention and storage. In our case at presentation, we partnered with another institution that took our online nursing program, and before we closed, and they agreed to serve as the institution of record for our students, so that, and alumni, so in the future, if they needed access to those records, they could go to that institution. Furthermore, they also offered to serve as kind of a alma mater for the institution, providing briefings and updates in ways that we wouldn't be able to after our institution was gone. And identification of that institution upfront is critical. Now, know in the advanced planning that you're also going to have to go through a disposition of assets phase, which is really going through the campus lands, buildings, equipment, and looking at how that will be transferred on to its next owner. You don't have to do all of that work before announcing, but you need to be aware of the breadth of that work, and especially when it comes to staggered employee separation planning, because you're going to need help with that disposition of assets.
Thank you, thank you. So another critical component of planning for a closure is the teach out plan. And this is an opportunity to engage with, of course, other partners and institutions who may want to help you support and serve your students. So I want to transition to the next slide while we move forward. And first, I want to ask Peter, to talk a little bit about how your institution approached the teach out plan, given that you did not work with external partners.
Great, thank you, Tiffany. So yes, so as I had indicated previously, a somewhat unique situation perhaps in the structure of Briarcliff College, having a parent company, is that Briarcliff had announced in March, I think, of 2016, Middle States had approved their teach out plan, but the plan was developed by Briarcliff. The institution was planning, obviously, to conduct an orderly closure. There were not teach out agreements with other institutions were not required by the commission because Briarcliff had actually created its own teach out plan. The commitment was made from the parent company, from CEC at the time, to ensure that all students down to the last one would be given the opportunity and resources necessary to complete their degrees. So the teach out plan that was structured around having the finances, the resources available to meet the needs, to make sure that we could pay the teachers, making sure that we have all the course offerings that we needed, any other resources in terms of the facilities that we needed, any software products that we needed. All of those things were kind of built into that teach out plan. The thing that was really not part of the plan was the notion of transferring the students to other institutions or trying to make agreements and find institutions. Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't students that may have looked to potentially transfer in any event. One of the advantages that we had, the nice thing where we were located, in New York, in the New York metro area, we are on Long Island, is that we have an abundance of institutions of higher education within a very close vicinity. We also, Briarcliff College was also part of what's called APC, which is the Association of Private Colleges, which is a small network of colleges within New York that actually meet on a regular basis. Briarcliff belonged to APC. They were active members of APC. They presented to APC, and they were in strong communication with these other family-owned institutions. And there were opportunities in the event that students were looking to perhaps move and transfer where there could be articulation agreements. There may be some that were in existence already with some of these other kind of sister institutions. So that was kind of a safety net that was provided, an opportunity that was provided because of this very close network of institutions that were really within a very close geographic area. So not to displace students too much. And it also worked to our advantage later on. We'll talk more about how faculty and staff were impacted. And that was an advantage, I think, perhaps. And I think Paula can add some clarity to a distinct difference where her institution was a more rural institution. So some of these opportunities and advantages may not have been available to her in a more rural. But that's more or less kind of how Briarcliff handled it. Paula?
Thanks, Peter. And it really is an important distinction. So Presentation College was located in rural South Dakota, about 3 hours to the next city. And so there weren't a lot of resources available in the community. There is in that community one state institution, very small, a couple thousand students. And so, and as a private college, not all of the students wanted to go to a state institution. So we had to look at the needs of the students and say, okay, what partners can we get for our students so that they chose presentation. We would like them to choose where they would like to go next, rather than be limited to just a couple partners. And so we started with a couple because the regional accreditor does require that you identify in advance and get teach out agreements with a number of partners, a handful, small handful before the announcement. And then afterwards, you have the opportunity to build on that, to really ask students. And I emailed the students. And again, small institution, most of them even knew me by name. You know, I had lunch with students whenever I could. It was an institution where we knew one another. And students, I said to them, where do you want to go? If there's a place you want to go and it's not on our teach out list, I will personally call the president of that institution and see if we can negotiate a teach out. I want you to finish where you want to finish. But here's the distinction between a teach out partner and a transfer institution or an articulation agreement or some other partnership that existed before. In many of those transfer situations, the transfer institution can pick and choose which credits to take and how much longer it will take the student to finish a degree. And we know as educators that there are a limited number of semesters that students are eligible for federal financial aid. So if they are, say, a first semester junior when you close, and they're looking to transfer somewhere that's only going to consider them a first semester sophomore, then they've just lost a year of potential federal financial eligibility, financial aid eligibility when they go to that institution. And what really struck me at presentation before we announced, I was having lunch with some students one day, and one student shared with me that he had previously attended an institution that announced in early November that they were closing. And the day that they announced, they said the students had 2 weeks to get out of the dorms and the building was going to be locked. And so this student hurried up and went home. The semester was disrupted. They didn't know if they were even going to get credit for that semester. He went home and he enrolled in a community college for the following January. It wasn't until February that that institution sent out a letter identifying their teach out partners. But by this time, the students, many of them, like the student telling me this story, had already enrolled somewhere else. And they didn't understand the difference between teach out and transfer. A teach out institution does two things that you see in number 2 and 3 on here that are critical. They guarantee the same time to degree completion. And the way they do this is that they guarantee not only to take every credit the student has earned at the closing institution, but also how it applies towards degree completion. Because we know it's very easy for institutions to say, we'll take them all, but those are elective credits. They have to guarantee if you have a year and a half to go, had your institution stayed open, you have a year and a half to go here. They can pick and choose which courses you need to complete in that year and a half that may differ a little bit from your closing institution, but it shouldn't take you longer. And number 3 is it shouldn't take the student more money. They're guaranteeing the same net out-of-pocket tuition. And when I say net out of pocket, if my institution charged $20,000 a year and your institution charges 30, but my student had 10,000 in scholarships and therefore was only paying 10,000 out of pocket, you've got to find a way as a teach out institution to match the amount of scholarship necessary so that they only have to pay 10,000 out of pocket there. Now you might say, why would we serve as a teach out? Wouldn't that cost us money? Not necessarily. When an institution that is closing has lots of teach out partners, then they don't get all of their students going to one teach out institution. We had 36 teach out partners for 600 students. So a lot of them went to a lot of different schools and many were able to be slotted into existing classes. So it really wasn't costing the teach out institution much, if anything at all. You don't do it to earn money and you don't do it to lose money. You do it out of the goodness of your heart because you care for these students. And so that's really critical. And to explain that difference in advance and to make sure there are flyers and posters all over campus explaining that difference between teach out and transfer, having it on the website, making sure that students understand so that they can protect themselves and their interests. Because I truly do see them as the most vulnerable when a college closes.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you both for those responses and that insight to the developing the teach out plan and executing it and serving students and of course working with other stakeholders. So Paula, as you mentioned, another critical component of the institutional closure process is communication. You mentioned it during your teach out plan component, but I would love to, start off with you and hearing more about how presentation approached communicating with stakeholders throughout the entire process once that announcement was made.
Thanks, Tiffany. Most of these communications were written in advance in that preparation stage, because as I mentioned earlier, so many questions are going to happen the moment you announce, and people are going to need answers right away or they're going to panic. And so really, I ask that this slide be organized in a way that we look at the different ways of communicating. First of all, in-person communication is really critical. After the announcement, I made sure I was visible. Too many presidents, I think, want to duck and hide somewhere because there's a lot of emotion that people are experiencing around this. And as the president, you're experiencing a lot of emotion as well, but you have to be available to people. I made sure that we did an in-person town hall meeting. We actually had two happen simultaneously. One of the vice presidents met with the students while I met with the faculty and staff. And there was a board member present also, because it was the board ultimately that made this decision. And if you have a sponsoring organization like both Peter did in his situation and we did at presentation, that the sponsoring organization has a presence as well. There need to be on-site counselors because people are going to have serious emotional reactions, and that's normal. This is a loss of something very critical in their lives. We made sure also with in-person that I met with every individual employee in an exit interview with the HR director. I feel like it's important to be available. And we also made sure that we had Q&A sessions, small group sessions afterwards throughout the weeks that followed announcement so that I could meet with individuals in a smaller setting where individuals could ask questions and get answers. In writing, there's a lot that needs to be prepared to go out onto your website. Not only will you be sending out a press release, but there should be a letter to parents and students. There should be letters to program accreditors, letters to vendors that owe money from your organization because they will be concerned. Really a comprehensive website with all of the teach outs posted, a frequently asked questions section, how to get more information. We put together a dedicated phone line and put that phone line out on the website. And then flyers and posters all over campus where people could go for counseling, where people could get information, the website information, and as I mentioned earlier, the difference between teach out and transfer. I think that events and sharing are also critical. I know that I'll start a little bit with sharing, let Peter join in here, and then we can kind of talk about events. But it was really important for me to have follow-up small group sessions. People need to not only get information, but to be heard about how they're feeling and how they're dealing with these things, and to have open Q&A. And then events, we had teach out fairs, we had transfer fairs, they were separate. We had job fairs for faculty and staff. Peter, I know you had additional events and additional sharing opportunities. Would you like to talk about those?
Sure. Yeah. So very similar. I think Paul, you've hit you've hit a lot of the major points. One of the things I would add is that we were given specific talking points from the president so that that we were all on the same page in the messages that were being delivered to students. Because again, opportunities throughout the time to meet with students. Students read their emails at different times. They So you believe it or not, even though you would think that information's been disseminated and most students know what's going on, you'll keep getting a trickle-down effect of students that will not really know what's going on, and then they'll start asking questions when they realize and hear. So it was important that everybody was kind of on the same page and was delivering the same message. So we were given specific talking points about how to speak to the students, areas, places to refer. But we did very similar things that you're talking about, Paula, and we continue to try to host the events that would normally be within the cycle. And that, things like graduation, that was very important, or commencement rather. Those things were very important. Students, wanted to feel like they got the complete experience. So in terms of hosting events, we tried to continue to do those types of things as well.
All right. Every sporting event continued through the duration of the semester. Everything was business as usual, just to be sure that nothing was cut out, that all of the support, all of the activities that were formerly planned were continued to be held so that students could have that sense of closure and the full experience, as Peter said. Thanks.
So both of you mentioned it at different times throughout this conversation about ways that your institutions engaged in stakeholder support. So we'll transition to the next slide. And I would love to, again, start with Paula to hear about what types of support did your institution provide?
I think the most important thing, and this slide is meant to be read from the bottom up, is that the foundation is taking care of people. Other things will fall into place, but we need to take care of people. We went into higher ed because we care about students, faculty, and staff, and the importance of an educational experience and support. It doesn't change when we have to close. And so, first of all, I think employee support services are important because our employees also provide support to students. And if they don't feel supported, they're not going to be able to be supportive to students. And so it's really important, if you have an EAP, to remind your faculty and staff of the availability of that. If you can bring in additional counselors from outside for your employees, that's really critical. If you can provide them support by writing reference letters. I emailed all my faculty and staff and said, anyone needs a reference letter from me, let me know, I will get one for you. Career counseling, as Peter mentioned earlier, and job placement, the opportunity to meet with the HR director and me one-on-one, talk about benefits conversions, unemployment. When we did transfer fairs and teach out fairs, I encouraged those institutions that were coming for the students to also bring their HR director to talk about opportunities they had for faculty and staff. We announced in January, which was really, I think, in many ways an ideal time because it's the beginning of the hiring cycle for faculty. So the new positions are starting to open up and be posted, and it gave them an opportunity to apply so they could have really continued employment from August through with us and then starting September somewhere else. So there wasn't any loss of benefits. We also made sure that our employee benefits, especially our faculty benefits, which normally might stop in May, carried through to the end of August. Those kinds of things are really important, taking care of your people. We gave them a list of talking points, like Peter mentioned, so that they would know the things that they could share with students also, because they're the student support services or part of it. We brought in additional counseling teams for students as well. And we created this position of transition advisor from our recruiters who were retrained to be transition advisors so that they could continue their employment through the end of August as well. FERPA waivers. We made sure that the students had available FERPA waivers so that they could provide information should they choose to right on the spot at the transfer fairs and teach out fairs. We made sure they had copies of their academic and financial transcripts if they wanted to have those without having to go out to the clearinghouse for that information. All students were given an opportunity to request records, as well as alums were all contacted and said there's an opportunity to request records before we transfer them to the holding institution that will hold them indefinitely after our closure. So in case they needed those for anything. These kinds of things are really critical. We talked earlier about maintaining academic continuity. I want to toss that back to Peter because I know he has a lot to say on that subject. And then we can discuss the last dance. Peter?
Thanks, Paula. If I could jump into student support services a little bit more, I just wanted to reiterate the fact that, the primary goal or our purpose in higher education is really our students, right? Our students are the number one consideration and concern. And it's extremely important to retain that even through the teach out. I think that with the announcement of a teach out, there's a lot of things that happen. As Paul has indicated before, there's a lot of emotion that's happening. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of concern, worry. Faculty and staff are worried about their next opportunity, about getting another job. Students are concerned about, finishing their degree, the value of their degree. But we can't lose sight of the fact that students are still our number one concern. And it's really important to have leadership that is able to kind of rein everybody in and make sure that they're not losing sight of the primary goal, and the primary focus is to make sure that these students that are at the institution are getting the quality of education, that faculty are still committed, right? You're not going to start running into a situation where faculty's attendance starts to fall off, where they start taking additional classes at other institutions to secure themselves, and they don't really care that much about your school, right? Now all of a sudden they stop showing up. Right? These are things that are really, really important to kind of keep a handle on. Student retention is still important, right? Students are out there now, and reputation is still important. It's a small community, especially where we are in the New York metro area, where there is a very dense population of institutions. It's important that you do the right thing. It's important that you are perceived in a manner that you have, really done right by your students. Maintaining reputation, retention. You don't want students to, become discouraged. They feel like, oh, no one cares anymore. No one's paying attention to me. And then they fall off, they drop, or they withdraw. They're still saddled with debt. They're still saddled with, and those are things that are typically a concern under normal circumstances, but I think that becomes even more highlighted and exasperated because we need to consider public scrutiny. We need to consider when the magnifying glass is on the institution, it's ever more present and important to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So having, as Paula indicated, transitioning, that was a wonderful idea she had with transitioning some of her folks into more of an advising role, providing academic advising for students. So as I said, with our institution, students still needed to plan out their schedules and take courses. We had to work with them to determine. We did not really have a fixed schedule at the time, but we had to kind of map out and fix a schedule because we can't run. Obviously, you can't run the amount of classes you run under normal circumstances. So we really had to figure out exactly what students needed to complete and provide those courses. The career counseling and the job placement. I think career services probably was at our institution at Briarcliff, they were the last man standing. Because don't forget, once students graduate, there is a time frame from the time they graduate to the time they get jobs in their place until the time that placement's verified. So placement statistics were extremely important. The institution was still very concerned at making sure that they had, adhered to the commitments they had made to make sure that every student had the opportunity to get employment. So that was something that Career Services was very involved with the career transition, still working on things like resume building, job searching, still maintaining databases and resources that we use, LinkedIn, other types of sources that were used by Career Services to make sure that they were able to give the students every opportunity to get the job, maintaining relationships with employers that they have had through, for example, if students are in health sciences and we have relationships with various hospitals for placing students there, making sure that those relationships, those agreements are still current, right through the time in which the institution is actually closing its doors. We want to keep all of those options open and keep all of those agreements current and active so that every student has the opportunity. That was a very important part. Something that's very underestimated, I think, at times, and not really, given as much consideration as necessary, is the mental health and wellness of everyone involved, right? Where are we going to provide, or how are we going to provide emotional support? In many cases, staff were doing multiple jobs. They were wearing multiple hats. Attrition is unfortunately realistic. We had attrition from the top. We had people that jumped ship. Understandably so. There were reasons people are looking out for their own, best interest, and there was a need to consolidate opportunities and to reach out to folks that were there. I worked with a handful of very, very strong and very, very dedicated staff that took on multiple roles, that wore multiple hats, and sometimes took on responsibilities and jobs that they weren't like thoroughly trained in, right? But they saw it as an opportunity to help the school. There was no rehiring, right? Nobody was going to be hiring to replace positions at that point. When you're in a teach out, you have to make do with what you've got. So it was an opportunity professionally for me to grow. I took on numerous opportunities and responsibilities, working on outcomes assessment, working on the online division, doing various things that needed to get done. So again, emotional support, counseling resources for students, navigating the stress of a closure for everyone involved. It's a very stressful process. And when you're facing and seeing, the institution, one of the campuses closing, and then we're consolidating. And when we have meetings and we talk about where are we at with the current population, how many students do we have left, right? What's the projection that we're going to have next month and next term? Seeing all those things happen, especially if you've been at the institution for a long time and you were there when the institution was thriving. I mean, Briarcliff College had tremendous sports teams, conference champions and trophies everywhere. And it was a very proud institution with a lot of great things happening. And now we see the consolidation. When you see the sale of the furniture, right? You see companies coming in, buying the furniture. It's a very emotional and stressful process, but it's important, I think. You have to be able to work hard as an administrator at an institution going through this to pump up the morale, right? You have to keep people motivated. How do you keep people motivated, when they perceive the ship is sinking, and keep students motivated, keep students engaged? We were very fortunate. We had tremendous people at Briarcliff. Our retention numbers got better and better. Students were really understood that they had a good opportunity to complete the programs and to graduate, and they stayed. So I was very proud of the fact that that was there. Resources and contacts. I think we need to create a list of contacts, resources, and support services available to students during this teach out. And to go back to Paula's point, that includes Middle States. That includes the regional accreditor. They are a wonderful resource, and it's necessary to communicate with them and to stay in touch. And part of our communication process was regular communication with Middle States about our progress and how things were going and if there were any obstacles. And also our parent company. One thing I have to say is they did a lot to try to support the institution. They were very visible, as Paula talked about before. They were hands-on. They were there to answer questions. They were there to meet with students and to meet with faculty and staff and to provide them with guidance. And that was very important. And I think another thing as it relates to kind of support is the internal oversight. I think some staff should be designated to monitor the teach out and to ensure that students' needs are being sufficiently met. So there is a need, to have oversight, whether it be your campus director or the president or whoever it is that should be available to kind of make sure that that things are moving in the right direction. And that there's an ongoing commitment and dedication to ensure that students, staff, and faculty are getting everything that they really, really need. In terms of maintaining continuity rather, plans to. I think I covered everything on that, Paula. So I think we're good.
Okay, thank you. I agree with all of the details that you provided there. Thank you so much. Last dance, I'd like to say that I made that up, but I didn't. That's what our students called the final semester at presentation. And they actually had t-shirts made that said Presentation College Last Dance. And really what that was about was knowing that everything we're doing for a final time. This is going to be our final season of softball. This is going to be our final game. This is going to be our final, whatever it is, fill in the blank. So let's do it with pride. Let's do it in a celebratory way, and make it count, make it matter. And we had, as a Catholic college, we had a final chapel that was open to the public, and it was just filled to overflowing. We had final tours, alumni tours of the campus open to the community. We had end of year celebrations, sort of on steroids, like really, really big. We didn't just do commencement. We did commencement big. We did the kinds of things, the last, our school was very into sports. 70% of our on-campus students were athletes. We had a huge end of year athletic banquet. The giveaways of all of the, bookstore swag, as the students like to call it, was big, because people wanted to associate with pride with the institution. And a lot of that is because of what Peter says, because we closed in a very dignified and responsible and ethical way that we could be proud of. And we wanted to remember when the highs were high and how incredible this institution has been to the community. We also, when it came to disposing of the assets, gave our faculty and staff the first opportunity to purchase things and at significantly discounted rates. And that was important. It's like saying these are things that you used. These are things that were important for you, like their laptops or their desktops, fleet vehicles on campus. We worked with the local high school, the Catholic high school, on taking possession of a lot of our sports items. They had the same colors. And so it's those kinds of things that we took what was really, it could have been a negative thing. And it is negative in the sense that it's sad to close an institution, but we tried to do it in a way that we could hold our head high and we could say, this was our institution. And to the very end, we're going to celebrate it and support it and associate ourselves as a part of it. We are the saints, Presentation College Saints. And one of the things that was said is, once a saint, always a saint. And we have t-shirts all around the community. I still wear my once a saint, always a saint. That pride continues. And it's really important that you embrace that pride at the end and give people that opportunity to enjoy those last moments and to get the kind of closure that those last moments together provide.
Thank you both for those detailed and very thoughtful approaches to supporting your various stakeholders. So some of these components were mentioned throughout the discussion today, but I would like us to move forward to the next slide and hear a little bit more about other long-term considerations that your institution took in mind as you continue to navigate this process. So we can start off with Paula.
Thank you. As Peter alluded to earlier, it was really important to us that we tracked our student placement. We wanted to make sure our goal was no student left behind. I mentioned how I reached out to students and asked them, where do you want to teach out? I'll reach out to that institution. We ended up developing 36 teach out agreements when only 2 were required by our accreditor. I remember my liaison going, how many more are you going to do? Every time I would send another one. And I said, I'm going to keep doing them until the last student asks, because I think it's really important. And then we tracked that. And what I discovered later is that only 49% of students nationally who are attending an institution when it closes, did I say 40? It's 47. I think I said 49, but it's 47% ever graduate. That is less than half, when their institution closes, ever go on to finish that degree. That is abysmal. And I did not know that statistic when we went through this process. But in the course of tracking our student placement rates and graduation rates, I discovered that presentations percentage was 88%. And I'm really proud of that. And that's really why people started calling and they said, what's the secret sauce? And I think the secret sauce is what we mentioned in an earlier slide. People come first. Whatever happens, your students, I think, are your number one priority because I see them as the most vulnerable. They don't know how to navigate this system. And of course, faculty and staff are vulnerable, and we take care of them as well. But when you take care of people, the rest will fall into place. So track those things, make sure that you're taking care of those students and each other. Because as you take care of each other, you have the resource internally to reach out to and give more to students. And Peter's going to talk a little bit, even though we both have things to say, I want to make sure Peter can share on how we do a lot of things to maintain connections with each other over the course of the closure process and afterwards. Peter?
Hey, thanks, Paul. Yeah, so maintaining connections, I think, is extremely important. And I think one of the things we need to leverage, this is an area that may be overlooked sometimes, not just during teach out, but even during normal operating business situations, is your alumni network. Briarcliff was the sad and kind of anticlimactic portion of this is right in the exact time frame in which the teach out was announced. 2 weeks prior, we were preparing for the 50th anniversary special celebration of Briarcliff College. It started as a secretarial school for women with white gloves, and one of our vice presidents had actually been a student there and had worked all the way through up to becoming vice president of student affairs. So working with your alumni, there is, thousands and thousands of students that have graduated. And even though the institution's closing, it doesn't mean that the alumni can't continue to work to support recent graduates, other graduates, help them with opportunities, jobs. So the alumni network and actually the president of the alumni is still someone that we still travel in circles and still part of our LinkedIn and Facebook and things of that nature. So very important. Again, attempting to keep faculty and staff. Briarcliff was a special place. I have to say very honestly that some of my longest lasting relationships and current today and friends that I have today are from Briarcliff. And Briarcliff closed in 2018. And I still have very tight relationships. Many of them still work in higher education, work at local and close institutions. We chat, we talk to each other, we write references for each other. We have a shared Facebook page. Briarcliff has monthly luncheons, which has a very strong attendance. We had a couple of unfortunate events. Every once in a while, these things will happen over the years. Someone will pass away and you'll have folks that will attend the wake. So it's a community. It doesn't mean that, everyone runs for the hills and we forget about it. Folks like to talk about, and this is common because I'm friends with a dozen or so folks from Briarcliff on Facebook, and we're always reminiscing about the good times. The other day, as a matter of fact, we were talking about someone shared a chachi from Briarcliff that they had, an ice scraper. Someone put on a photo on the Facebook. Look, using the Briarcliff ice scraper to scrape off ice. And other ones said, I still use the gym bag, and I still use the gym bag. So, it warms my heart when you hear those conversations because, it's still alive. It doesn't have to die. Even though the institution's been closed now for, 6-7 years, it doesn't have to die with that. So that's very, very important to keep those types of things going. The other thing, too, I want to say is, again, I talked about this before, belonging to APC, which is an association of private colleges. That's a very tight-knit family. There's a lot of family-owned colleges there in the New York area. So there's an opportunity for faculty and staff to have places to go because people they know Briarcliff, right? If you worked there, then if there's opportunities available, they're happy to to bring you on and give you an opportunity to work there. So that's been a very, very positive thing as well. And in terms of closure, something to talk about is, besides ensuring that all our students complete their programs and helping faculty and staff finding new opportunities, and dealing with things like landlords and leasing companies for copiers and printers and things of that nature. And as Paula talked about, storage of records and shredding and garbage and, career services staff, being around to the end. I think it was important, at the end when the dust kind of starts to settle, is to really reflect and evaluate whether or not, we did a good job. Were we effective? Could we have done things differently or better? So I just think that's an important thing to take into consideration and to be mindful, to be evaluative of it. Because being part of an institution that closes, that's going to be part of your professional career forever. Unless you lie on your resume and you take it off for some reason. Every job I've gone to, it's people knew, and many of the places knew Briarcliff or knew of Briarcliff and asked about the closure. And I was very proud to state that it was makes you stronger. Something, what doesn't destroy you makes you stronger, but it demonstrates perseverance. It demonstrates commitment. It demonstrates your ability to overcome challenges. And those are traits and skills and things that are valued, because in all honesty, we understand that higher education is a landscape that is an industry that is constantly in flux. And there are ebbs and flows throughout, and so bringing a skill set that you're a warrior brings value, gives you value. So in my mind, I see that as a very, very positive thing. And I think, again, to be proud of how the institution handles adversity, how the institution maintained a morale among faculty, staff, and students, those are all things. So those are just some of the closing comments or thoughts regarding the closure and how we should assess our role in the closure and, how we handle it. So, Paul, I don't know if you had anything, or Tiffany?
That was beautifully stated. I think a lot of people are afraid of being associated with an institution that closes for fear there's a black mark on their career. And my response is, it depends on how you do it. If you do it with dignity, with responsibly, if you do it ethically, if you take care of your people, then, as Peter said, it's something that we should be proud of, that we did it right, because not every institution is going to survive. This presentation, when I came to it, I was brought in and asked by the board if it was long-term viable. I was brought in on a 6-month interim presidency because they were considering closing at that time already. So these things don't happen because of bad presidents, bad boards. Higher ed is changing. The marketplace is changing. We really seriously overbuilt institutions in the 50s and 60s in this country, and not as many students are going to college these days. It is not surprising that we're seeing closures, and we're anticipating another few hundred in the next 5 years. And this is, there was one that announced today that I read about in the news already. It's happening, and it's not about blame. It's about, how do we do this and take care of people? We're responsible when we open an institution, we're responsible when we close one. And ultimately, if you do it well, it should be something that you're proud of and not something that you're ashamed of.
Thank you both. We're going to move forward. And at this time, I want to invite our colleagues to submit questions that they may have using the Q&A function in your Zoom toolbar. And while we wait for some questions to come in, I just want to take a moment to thank you both for sharing your experiences and the intentionality that you described in approaching the institutional closure process. So to start us off, the first question is going to be directed towards Peter. How did your institution maintain quality for students, given that you were taught out over 3 years? As staff and faculty started to leave for other jobs, how did you maintain quality over those final years?
Great question. We adhered to the principles of the institution, the mission of the institution, the core values of the institution didn't change. We were also fortunate to have full-time faculty who had been with the institution. Many of our full-time faculty had been with the institution 15, 20 years. And they were dedicated and committed to making sure that they finished what they started. And very honestly, we had engaged folks. We had a dean, we had a campus director that were extremely engaged in the process. We still had regular meetings. We did not cease meeting committees, curriculum meetings. We did not cease. We did adjust, obviously, our strategic plan, but we didn't cease the operations that are integral to ensuring that quality is there, reviewing courses, making sure, obviously there were limitations and things that we could do and changes that we could make, but making sure that the textbooks and resources were there. The biggest thing was faculty. The biggest thing was making sure that faculty were motivated. I spent a lot of time on my campus going in and doing observations, working with faculty, talking to faculty, making sure that we were transparent. talking to students, asking them what their concerns were. You don't stop surveying students. You don't stop asking. Right? We do student NPS surveys. We do student satisfaction surveys, course evaluations. We don't stop any of that. That continues. That's part of the process in my mind until the very end. We don't cease those things. We're doing them not to check a box. We're doing them because they have value and because they provide information that informs on our ability to improve the quality of what we do. And quality until the last student graduates was the mantra. And those are just the types of things that we continue to do to the end. It was a lot of work because we had less and less folks there to do the work, but we still commit to the work and we still make sure the work gets done. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And I actually want the latter part of that question. I want to propose it to Paula. At your institution, how did you convince those to be as committed as you were in closing the college in a student-centered way?
Well, I don't think I had to convince the faculty and
Okay.
staff at presentation to maintain quality. I mean, they were superior faculty and staff. I don't think people go into this business for any other reason than for the love of students and for education. But I do think a huge part of it was taking care of them. When people are taken care of, it's easier for them to take care of others. And that's where that advanced planning comes. I know some institutions let go a lot of people when they announce. We let go no one. When we announced, everyone had a job at least through the end of May, and we announced in January. And even though through August, when we were, very limited, we just had a few summer classes going and we were starting the disposition of assets. Those who didn't find other opportunities right away were invited to stay and help us with the disposition of assets. And so when you find ways, you're going to need people. And when you find ways to offer those opportunities, people realize how much you care. And they're just as committed as they have been, and maybe even more, realizing how hard it is. I mean, at the very end, we were cleaning the kitchen and I was down there with my hands full of grime as well. I mean, we were in this together. And I think they saw that. No one was sitting up on a high perch saying, this is how this is going to go. But it was, how can we help each other get through this very difficult situation and still take care of each other?
Thank you, Paula. So we have a follow-up question for Briarcliff about that internal teach-out plan that you executed. One of your colleagues would like to hear more about how you were able to support every student to the finish line without an external teach-out. And a few examples that they referenced in the question reference students that may have failed the class or maybe had to take a leave related to mental health. How were you able to ensure that you could execute that teach-out to the end?
Great question. I'll be perfectly transparent in terms of the fact that I really didn't handle and wasn't intimately involved in the nuts and bolts of those processes. I can speak more generally about the fact that we provided every opportunity. We had online classes. We had double sessions for online classes. So we had 7-week sessions that ran 2 7-week courses. We had summer classes. We did everything that we could, winter sessions that we were able to incorporate. Now, a student that needed to take a leave of absence for a long period of time, chances are that if we weren't able to accommodate them, then we would look to probably have them transfer. I think that was few and far between. And from my best recollection, I would say, a large majority of the students were able to be accommodated based on the plan. As I said, our retention was very, very high. As we moved closer throughout the process, retention numbers exceeded, 85, 80%, 90%. So there was a small percentage of students that weren't able to complete. But we did everything we could from a scheduling standpoint. And it was like putting together a jigsaw puzzle. We had one of our associate deans who became the dean. She was magnificent at coordinating the scheduling and sitting down and really analyzing and figuring out. So it did work out, but yes, there were going to be students, there were going to be outliers, there were going to be individual situations that may have fallen outside the scope of that. But I know that the institution made every effort to find alternate opportunities to accommodate those students. We had relationships with many other institutions. And I'm sure that those students were directed and guided in to alternate opportunities. But we were fortunate that for the most part, we were able to accommodate those students.
Thank you. So this next question is for both of you, but we're going to start off with Paula. How aware was the community, both greater community and internally, faculty, staff, and students, that this was coming? How much time and how informed were they, and when were they engaged in the process of navigating the closure?
Mhm. So as I mentioned, when I was brought in fall of 2019, there were already conversations about closure. And as I spent time on the campus and in the community, I heard people saying that for decades, people talked about Presentation College is going to close. So I think there was an awareness of the peril that small private colleges are in this country, and how very small we were and how very remote we were and how difficult it is to retain an institution in those circumstances. So I think that, generally that awareness was there, and I was certainly brought in as someone who was going to look at that. And I put a lot of press releases out to the newspaper about how we were trying to regroup when we were originally trying to look for a partner. We talked to the faculty and staff directly in meetings about how we were searching for a partner to work with us, to maybe grow our nursing program. We had the 4th ranked in the country online LPN to BSN program, but we could only serve students in 7 states when I came, 8 when I closed the institution, because we didn't have the bandwidth to be able to take that out to all 50 states, to cultivate clinical sites in 50 states, to, hire adjunct professors in 50 states. And so we were looking for a partner for that program. Of course, regularly, I think it's important in shared governance to share the finances with the institution. Not all presidents do that, and to say, here's where we are. And with the board, from day one, I said, I'm going to be upfront. You're going to know what's happening. It might not be pretty, but I'm not here to dress things up. I'm here to solve problems and to present accurately. So there was an awareness of where we were and how we were really trying to keep the wool from the door. There's also a period of time when you recognize the board's looking at voting towards closure, um, that there is an NDA in place because they don't want it to go out to the public before the announcement. And the reason for that is really simple, and that is students fleeing, and they might flee to their own detriment. If a student leaves and doesn't take advantage of, carefully crafted teach out agreements, then they could transfer and, lose their federal funding and, pay more and take longer or never finish those degrees. And so it's really important to have all of those preparations in place to take care of people before the announcement. And those are the hardest months of the process. I don't think anybody's blindsided by it because of all of the community conversations. But when the board finally votes, there is a time between the board voting, and for us, I want to say it was the first week of December. And then we announced in the first week of January. So there was a month in there when we were getting all of these pieces together that I knew and others didn't. And that was probably the most horrendous emotionally, to carry that weight, but also to recognize you're doing it to protect everyone. Those extra few weeks notice would not have helped anyone in particular, but it certainly helped to have the preparation ready for the announcement.
Thank you. Peter?
Sure. So in our situation, I think there was a confluence of a lot of different factors that went into it. And I think that faculty, staff, students, and the general community were fairly aware of the environment. I think it's a very environmental thing. So Briarcliff College being a proprietary school, there's a lot of forces that are at play. So the political scene is definitely a factor. There were a lot of talk and discussions about closures of institutions in and around this time, particularly probably in the 2012, 13, 14 timeframe. Things like gainful employment, which was a very onerous regulation, federal regulation coming down that definitely influenced and impacted institutions in terms of looking at programs of study and whether or not they would be able to meet that. These were conversations that were happening. These were conversations that were being had. Concurrently, at the same time, there was discussions by the parent company, CEC, about maybe divesting interest in some of their institutions due to regulatory concerns, right? So schools in New York in particular, there were some challenges with working with some of these institutions because some of the regulatory landscape. So there had been some conversations that were going around, some discussions about mergers and or sale. So that's how the conversation started. So I think there were many stakeholders around the institution and around the community that were aware that there was discussion and conversation surrounding a potential sale of the institution, just because, Career Education Corp just felt that there was too much, whether it be economic responsibility associated with owning a school under, more difficult regulatory concerns. So that's how the conversation started. And actually, there were one or two suitors, and there was a deal that was in place. So the teach-out happened when when the acquisition didn't go through. And that was kind of the last resort, was the teach-out. So it isn't as if this happened overnight. It isn't as if this was something that was a total surprise, because there was clear and transparent communication surrounding the fact that we were being courted by a number of different potential suitors and being to be purchased, and what that might look like, right? There was open discussions and meetings with representatives from some other institutions that were looking to purchase the school, and what the academic structure and programs might look like. So there was a runway of time in which I think people were on notice that the environment was changing, and that Briarcliff was most likely going to undergo some sort of transformation. What that exact transformation was, no one was sure, and people were hopeful that it would be a purchase or a merger, and that the institution would stay open in some form.
Thank you. So this next question is about finances. And starting with Paula, this is a two-part question. How did your institution manage cash flow needs when there was a diminishing revenue stream, but you still had those fixed and variable costs? And then the second part is, did you need to raise additional funding while going through this closure?
So the first part, I think it's really important for presidents and boards to recognize how much runway they have. I like to call it runway, the time and the resources before a significant change is going to have to take place, either a partnership, a merger, or a closure of the institution. In other words, you might say, we have 2 years left of finances that are going to be able to get us through. And that's it. I mean, otherwise we're not going to make it. And so you have to plan in advance. You can't just wait until you've spent your last dollar and go, oh no, well, what are we going to do now? I guess we're going to have to close. That would be very irresponsible. And so we certainly had the runway, and we had the awareness of what that timeline looked like, which is why we went out looking for a partner. And that was a very strategic process over quite a number of months of bringing in potential prospective partners to the board for consideration, and they're making their pitches and then final proposals and all of those things. So you have to know, and I always tell my clients, you need to plan on multiple tracks. You have to plan for potential partnership merger, for some potential turnaround success, because that's what you want. But ultimately, at the same time, you have to plan for closure. You can't wait to see if the partnership's going to collapse and then start discussing closure, because you lose that preparation time and those funds. And we had to put aside funds. One of the things that Peter and I both alluded to is that people are going to leave the institution once you announce. My faculty did not leave because we were on an academic cycle, and it was really a perfect time for them to transition into a next opportunity. But some of our staff left within a couple of weeks of our announcing. we had to prepare for that and have funds set aside. We couldn't hire, but we could bring in temporary folks, and we did have to. And I mean, there are some serious things if you're a small institution that if I lose my financial aid director, I have got to have another one in here. If I lose my registrar, I have got to have another one. And I can't just transition, a former coach to suddenly being a registrar or a financial aid director. I have to have someone who has that background. So we set aside funds to be able to pay for, going through one of these services that are available to bring in a temporary person in different positions. And you have to plan for that because you know that you're not necessarily going to be fundraising, though we did specifically, as I mentioned earlier, fundraise to cover summer session for the students that needed it to graduate. And those were the students that we brought in on those scholarships. 100% paid for, because we didn't want them not to be able to get their presentation college degree because they'd used up all of their federal financial aid in fall and spring semesters. But you have to be forthright if you're fundraising also with your donors that this is a closure fundraising, that we are raising these funds to help students finish. And, by and large, it was alums who wanted to help students become alums of Presentation College with them.
Thank you. And I'm not sure, Peter, did you have anything that you would like to add?
Sure. I always have something to add. So Briarcliff, again, was a slightly unique situation. Paula did a lot of grassroots things at her institution, and she did a great job managing the finances. We had a tremendous CFO at our institution who became the campus director, campus president, and he was very fiscally minded. He did a lot of great projections and looking at what was the income based on retention of students. But we had a lot of things in play, right? So we had a parent company that owned the institution that had made a commitment to providing the resources to make sure that students graduated. We also did, some of the costs were reduced and consolidated as we gave up space. We saved on leases. Leases for us was huge. One of our campuses was like 125,000 square feet, I think, or more, and the lease for that space was very high. So our CFO, campus president, worked very hard in creating a timeline for which we would be able to reduce costs. We sold furniture. So in that campus in which we consolidated and gave back space, eventually left that building to go to another space, we were able to sell furniture. But a lot of it came from the backing and support that we knew we were getting from the parent company. Once we figured out what we were going to have in terms of tuition as a result of students and that our retention numbers were very strong, once we cut costs by getting rid of space and other areas and things that were done to kind of reduce costs, and as attrition happened, as Paula talked about, a lot of the attrition happened from the top. So your bigger salaries were the ones that left. So we were able to kind of save and reduce expenses that way as well. But consolidating, once we reached a certain point and consolidating both campuses into one campus, into a smaller space, really was helpful because we did sign a short-term lease at a particular place. The cost was per square foot was a lot less. So again, we were able to consolidate and reduce our expenses quite a bit, and that's kind of how we manage that.
Thank you. So for Paula, this next question is related to Teach Out Partners specifically. What role did the instructional modality play that a Teach Out Partner may offer? For example, if your institution had any just in-person, hybrid, or online courses, what role did the Teach Out Partner play in ensuring that students had the same offerings?
That's critical. So thank you for that question. Not only every major, but every modality of that major, it's important to have a Teach Out Partner in. So for example, we had an online nursing program and an on-site nursing program. So we made sure that we had at least 2 Teach Out Partners for starters that offered an on-site nursing program and 2 Teach Out Partners that offered an online nursing program, so that every student in every major and every modality had at least 2 options. And then from there, of course, if students asked for another institution I made sure that I reached out to that institution. But that is critical, because if a student can only take courses online, say they have a family and are holding down a job somewhere, and they're, watching their children and only can do evenings and weekends, we have to make sure that they can graduate. So that is really important, not only, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that's part of what you will learn when you reach out to your regional accreditors. They have information on those compliance issues. I see Tiffany nodding. I worked with HLC on our closure, but I have since worked with a number of other accrediting organizations, and it's pretty comparable across the country, that they're going to make sure that you protect students in the modality that they are currently receiving delivery.
Thank you. And yes, you're absolutely correct. The expectation is that institutions will have a teach-out partner, as you said, for each educational program, as well as modality and delivery of that program and those courses. So this question is for both of you. However, we're going to start with Peter. You mentioned it throughout the presentation, but we have a question about hearing how did your regional accreditor, specifically in this case, Middle States, support your institution as you navigated the institutional closure process?
Well, right out of the gate, Middle States supported the institution by accepting our teach out plan, and the fact that we developed the teach out plan, and the fact that the institution made a commitment to teach out its students without needing partners, teach out agreements. So that was one place and one way in which they definitely supported us. There were regular communications with Middle States. We had several monitoring reports that were due, opportunity substantive changes that needed to be submitted. So there was regular check-ins and regular requirements for updates to be provided. My sense is that Middle States had some trust in Briarcliff, having had an exemplary a record throughout its time. I think Briarcliff was originally, candidacy was granted like in 1989, accreditation granted in 1996. I was at the institution through the reaccreditation process in 2010, and we had a very exemplary record. So there seemed to be a level of trust. I also was the one to complete, at that time, we were required to submit a periodic review report. And because the institution was going to be open until 2018, the periodic review report was due in 2017. So I did that, and that obviously that periodic review report was based on a complete revamp to our strategic plan, meaning that we went from growth and expectations to expand programs and to offer advanced degrees to how we were going to support our students. So I think there was plenty of communication and transparency between the institution and Middle States, and Middle States was really there trusting us and giving us any advice and answering questions. So it was a wonderful relationship, and I built a lot of lifelong friendships with folks at Middle States coming from that period.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I just want to add another component from the Middle States perspective. It is critical that institutions tell us as soon as possible so that we are able to support you and provide assistance. Keep in mind that if an institution notifies us that the institution is in that advanced planning stage of the institutional closure, but it's not ready to formally announce, that's the time to tell your regional accreditors so that they can provide guidance and support, recognizing that they will not publicly disclose that information until the proper moment. So just keep that in mind for all of our institutions who are wondering, how can you get assistance from your regional accreditor? Please view us as partners in providing guidance when you're navigating that process. Paula, I certainly want to give you the opportunity to share how Presentations Regional Accreditor was able to assist them and support your institution as you navigated closure.
I concur with everything you've said, Tiffany. In fact, I think at the very least, when the board votes, your regional accreditor needs to know. I called ours, I was working with HLC, I called ours long before that, when the board started having conversations about closure, and it looked like that was where we were going. I called and honestly, I think the accreditor was a bit surprised because they don't usually get notified until it's quite late. Pleasantly surprised. And that's where you want to be on a great relationship with your accrediting organization because then the pressure's off. They're used to people saying, we're going to close the door at 4 o'clock or next week. And they're panicked because they know you've got to get all that preparation and they've got to help you get there. When you can call them and say, we have a year left of finances. And we're looking at potential closure, and the board is going to be voting on it at the next quarterly meeting. What are some things I can do to get started on, preparing for this? And maybe it won't happen, and maybe we'll have a turnaround, but what can I do? They're super receptive. They're like, this is amazing. Because the more that you can do, the less that it's going to be on their shoulders. And I know that everyone's aware that there are institutions who have announced abrupt closures and left their accrediting organizations trying to meet with students and meet with parents. And that's irresponsible because it's responsible on the part of the accreditor, but it's irresponsible on the part of the institution that is leaving these sort of new faces to work with their students and their parents. So the earlier you can reach out, the better. And frankly, there's nothing that my accreditor wanted more than us to turn it around and not have to close. They weren't going to force the issue, but they were going to say, okay, here's some things you want to think about. Here's the compliance process. In general, your accreditor is very attuned to the compliance process. And the other pieces of it, honestly, I learned, shooting from the hip. And that's why today I do what I do, trying to help other institutions because there's a lot to learn in that process. But your accreditor is at least going to make sure that you get all of the compliance pieces done properly and is going to be a major support for you at a time when there isn't a lot of support out there for you and you're going through a very difficult process.
Thank you. So in our final question to close us out, I'll start with Peter. In hindsight, is there anything that you wish that your institution would have done differently or done at all while navigating the closure process that you would like to advise your colleagues today?
Yeah, that's a great question. Honestly, I have to say that from my vantage point, and maybe it's just romantically tainted, but I really, this was the first time I was going through something like this. And I really felt that based on students' response and feedback and how they felt that the institution handled it, I can't really think that there were really anything major that if it had to happen, right? I think it really comes down to the reality setting in and really understanding that this is where we're going to be going and this is the path we have to take. They did everything the way I think ideally the way that the institution should proceed. There's really nothing else that I can think of at the time that I would have seen them do differently. Like I said, they provided a wonderful location to consolidate the campuses so that students had a nice facility. The facility was so nice actually that we were trying to figure out a way that we could have stayed there, after the closure. We could have, done something. So that was a wonderful thing. No, honestly, I can't. On reflecting on it, I can't come up with anything. But great question.
Okay, Paula.
I think we can always do things better. I probably the number one thing that came to mind as you answered that question is that we brought in a group that we contracted with through some funding that we received to meet with students on the day of the announcement, to be able to help them deal with their emotions, to be able to make some choices, make sure that they stayed on campus and didn't panic. And I wouldn't do that again because they were outside group and students are going to go to who they trust. I did bring those folks back later and that was a more receptive time. First, I brought them back to meet with the coaches and the counselors and the advisors that the students knew to help prep them better. And in many ways, when your advisor, your counselor, your teacher says, you know, Tiffany's not part of our campus, but she's a great resource, please go to her. They'll go to her because of that recommendation. And so I think you need to give people time to grieve and to take in the shock of the moment. The announcement is always a shock, I think, even if you do see it coming, because now it's real. Now we know that this is actually happening and it's happening now. I mean, they talked about it for apparently decades in the Aberdeen community, but now it's real. And all of the implications of that, we're emotional creatures as human beings. And so, you know, probably to just give people more time to process with each other instead of bringing in the outside support immediately, might be something that I would reconsider or consult with a professional on how that could be handled in the best possible way. No matter how well you plan, no matter how responsible all of your choices are, it is a very, very difficult thing to happen. And perhaps one of the most difficult things as a president was that I had to put my feelings somewhere else for right now because I had to help other people process theirs. And so I think everyone at some point needs an outlet. And to be able to provide that in a safe way is critical and also part of the showing that you care about people and putting people first.
Thank you for that statement. This will conclude our session. Thank you again to our presenters, and thank you for attending today's event. To learn more about future events, please visit msche.org and follow us at msche.org on YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.